Imagine walking into work knowing that every match you make could be slowly destroying your face. It is the 19th century, and inside a crowded match factory, workers sit for hours, dipping small wooden sticks into chemical mixtures. The work looks simple. The product is tiny, but the air carries a sharp chemical smell, and the same dangerous material touches the workers again and again. At first, the warning can seem ordinary. A tooth begins to hurt, then the gums swell. The pain becomes unbearable. Eventually, the damage can reach the jaw itself. For some workers, the bone begins to die. The condition becomes known as phossy jaw. And the horrifying part is that these workers are not making weapons or complicated machines. They are making matches. The little sticks that sit inside almost every household seem harmless. Strike one, and a flame appears almost instantly. But behind that tiny flame is a story of chemistry, industrial ambition, poverty, worker resistance, and a terrible question: how much human suffering is acceptable for something this small? The answer begins with humanity's ancient struggle to control fire. For thousands of years, creating fire required preparation, patience, and skill. Then, 19th century chemistry began changing that relationship. Fire could be carried, fire could be bought, fire could be created with a single movement. The match was about to become one of the most useful objects in everyday life. But before it became ordinary, it would become dangerous. And the people who discovered that danger would pay a price consumers could barely imagine. For most of human history, fire was something people had to work for. They needed dry material, a spark, patience, and skill. Then chemistry changed the equation. Inventors discovered mixtures that could ignite when exposed to friction. Wooden splints gave those mixtures a simple shape. Suddenly, a person could carry a tiny source of fire almost anywhere. Early friction matches were a remarkable breakthrough. Strike the stick, watch the flame appear. The process compressed a complicated human problem into a few seconds. Demand grew rapidly because the match solved an everyday problem almost everyone understood. It could light candles, fireplaces, stoves, lamps, and countless other sources of heat and light. But the same chemistry that made some early matches easy to ignite also created a dangerous manufacturing environment. As demand increased, matchmaking became industrial. Factories filled with workers preparing wooden splints, mixing chemicals, dipping them, drying them, sorting them, and packing them. The work was repetitive because the product had to be produced in enormous quantities, and the cheaper matches became, the more important speed and low production costs became. For the customer, a match meant convenience. For the worker, making that match could mean long hours beside dangerous chemicals. One of the most troubling materials used in the industry was white phosphorus. Exposure could produce a devastating occupational disease. At first, the danger could be easy to overlook. A worker might experience a toothache and assume it was ordinary. Then came swelling, then infection, then damage to the jaw. Eventually, the disease could become impossible to hide. The match had conquered fire, but inside the factories producing it, workers were beginning to discover its price. The terrible thing about phossy jaw was how quietly it could begin. A worker could arrive at the factory apparently healthy and spend day after day performing the same task. Dip, dry, pack, repeat. Nothing about the wooden sticks suggested what the chemicals could do to the human body. Then the symptoms appeared. A tooth might begin to ache, the gums could swell, an infection could develop. Eventually, the disease could attack the jawbone. The pain could become severe, and the damage could be permanent. For workers, This was more than a medical problem. It was a question of survival. Many depended on their wages. Leaving the factory could mean losing income needed to support themselves or their families. Staying meant continuing to face conditions that could make them sick. The contradiction was brutal. The match was becoming one of the most convenient products of the industrial age, while some of the people producing it were suffering because of the chemicals involved, and the product was becoming cheaper at the same time. A cheap match encouraged enormous demand. Enormous demand encouraged mass production. Mass production required workers. The cycle kept expanding, but eventually the evidence became too strong to ignore. Doctors began recognizing that the strange jaw disease was associated with phosphorus exposure. The suffering was not simply bad luck, it was connected to the workplace. Once the danger had a recognizable cause, the industry could no longer easily pretend that nothing could be done. There were safer alternatives, but safer production could cost more. The manufacturers wanted an inexpensive product. The workers needed protection. The public wanted cheap matches. Society had to decide whether the price of convenience should include the health of the people producing it. Inside match factories, workers understood the problem differently from consumers. They knew the smell. They knew the chemicals. They knew what happened when workers became sick. Many were also dealing with low wages, demanding work, and harsh factory conditions. For an individual worker, complaining could be dangerous. The factory provided the wage. The wage helped provide food. Losing the job could create another crisis. But workers could do something individually that was difficult to do together. They could stop. In London, women and girls working at the Bryant and May match factory became part of a confrontation that attracted widespread public attention. Their action was about more than one unpleasant day at work. It reflected deeper complaints about wages, discipline, working conditions, and treatment. When the women went on strike in 1888, the story escaped the factory. Newspapers reported on the dispute. The public began hearing about the people behind the matches. Suddenly, a product that looked harmless had a human story attached to it. That mattered because consumers rarely think about the person who makes the thing they buy. They see the finished product. They see the price. They use it. The factory disappears. The strike helped reverse that. The workers made the hidden production process visible. Their action demonstrated that workers were not simply another part of the machinery. They could organize. They could refuse. They could force an employer to listen, but a strike alone could not solve the chemical problem. The dangerous substance was still there. Workers could demand better treatment, but the industry still needed to confront what was inside the match. A safer form of phosphorus could be used. The technology existed. The real question was whether manufacturers were willing to change. The match industry had reached a crossroads. The old method worked. That was its greatest defense. The matches ignited. Consumers wanted them. Factories could produce them. Manufacturers could sell them cheaply. But something can work and still be unacceptable. The suffering caused by dangerous phosphorus exposure made that clear. A safer alternative existed. The challenge was making that safer alternative commercially practical. The industry had to consider materials, production costs, competition, and consumer expectations. For years, the cheap match had an enormous advantage. People wanted a product that was inexpensive and reliable. Manufacturers wanted to satisfy that demand. But workers were asking a different question. Why should the price of a cheap match be paid through their health? That question became harder to dismiss as public awareness grew. Safer matches represented a major change. Instead of relying on the dangerous chemistry associated with white phosphorus, safer designs used different materials and separated parts of the ignition process. The safety match was especially important because it changed both how the match was used and how it could be produced. The match head no longer had to contain everything necessary for ignition. The striking surface became part of the system. This made accidental ignition less likely and opened the way towards safer production. But technology alone did not create reform. Workers had to expose conditions. Doctors had to identify the disease. Reformers had to make the problem visible. Manufacturers had to accept that the old system could not continue forever. A safer invention can exist without immediately becoming the standard. Sometimes the problem is not whether a solution exists. It is whether enough pressure exists to make people use it. The safety match did not destroy the match industry. It helped save it from its own history. The basic purpose remained unchanged: create fire quickly. But the chemistry and production method could be changed. Progress does not always mean replacing an invention completely. Sometimes it means rebuilding the invention so that it causes less harm. The match was a perfect example. For consumers, the change was almost invisible. They still opened a box, took out a stick, struck it, and watched a flame appear. But inside production, the transformation was much larger. The most dangerous phosphorus methods could be replaced. The industry could move towards safer chemistry. People working in factories could be protected from a danger that had once seemed inseparable from the product. This is why the story matters beyond matches. It demonstrates how society learns. First comes invention, then widespread use, then consequences appear. Then people identify those consequences. Pressure builds. Finally, the invention is changed. The process is rarely comfortable. Often the people who discover the danger are the ones who suffer first. That was true for match workers. Their experiences exposed the difference between technological success and human success. A product can sell millions of units and still be produced under unacceptable conditions. A factory can be profitable and still harm its workers. A cheap product can have a cost that does not appear on the price tag. The match forced those contradictions into the open. And once the industry changed, the danger gradually disappeared from everyday awareness. The safer the match became, the less people remembered why it needed to become safer. Consumers saw an ordinary household object. They did not see the workers, protests, scientific discoveries, or reforms. They simply saw a flame. But that flame represented decades of change. It represented the idea that workers should not have to sacrifice their health simply because a product is useful. Once the match became reliable and affordable, it transformed ordinary life. Fire was no longer something people had to prepare for each time. A candle could be lit quickly. A stove could be started. A fireplace could be brought to life. A traveler could carry a source of fire without carrying a complicated fire-making kit. The match compressed effort into seconds. That is what made it revolutionary. But inventions become powerful not only because they solve problems, they become powerful because they change expectations. Once people became accustomed to instant fire, older methods began to feel unnecessary. Convenience became normal. That is why the match spread so widely. It was small, cheap, simple, and useful. It required almost no explanation. A person did not need to understand chemistry to use one. The match simply worked. And because it worked so well, people stopped thinking about it. That is the strange fate of successful inventions. They become invisible. Nobody celebrates a match every time they light a candle. Nobody thinks about the chemistry. Nobody thinks about the factory. Nobody thinks about the worker. The object becomes ordinary, but its ordinariness hides its historical importance. The match helped change cooking, lighting, household routines, travel, industry, and many other activities that depended on fire. It also became part of a larger technological transition. Electricity eventually transformed lighting. New ignition systems appeared. Lighters offered alternatives, yet the match survived. Why? Because simplicity is difficult to defeat. A match needs no battery, charging cable, or complicated mechanism, just a deliberate strike. That basic design remained useful even as technology advanced, but its survival also made it easier to forget the darker history of its production. The consumer could enjoy convenience without seeing the struggle that made safer matches possible. The match represents two revolutions. The first gave humanity fire on demand. The second taught society that convenience should not require unnecessary human suffering. There is something strange about how cheap a match is. You can buy an entire box for very little. Lose it, and you probably will not worry. Strike one, and after a few seconds, it is gone. But the history of the match shows that cheapness does not always tell you the full cost of a product. For workers exposed to dangerous phosphorus, the cost could be measured in pain, damaged teeth, destroyed bone, and permanent injury. The consumer saw a cheap object. The worker experienced the production process. Those realities could exist at the same time without the consumer knowing. That is one of the most important lessons hidden inside the match. A finished product can look harmless, while the process behind it is dangerous. The match made that contradiction visible. It also demonstrated why worker protection cannot depend entirely on individual workers. If danger is built into a production process, the process itself must change. Telling a worker to be more careful is not enough if the chemical environment remains dangerous. The safer solution is to remove or reduce the danger. That idea eventually became central to modern thinking about workplace safety. The match industry was part of that transition. Workers who suffered did not create the danger. They were exposed because they needed employment. Choosing a job is not the same as choosing to be poisoned. Once that became clearer, the responsibilities of employers and industries came under greater scrutiny. The story, therefore, moves beyond matches. It becomes a story about what society expects from businesses. Should profit be the only measure of success? Should a product remain cheap if its workers are suffering? Should a safer alternative be ignored because it costs more? The history of the match demonstrates why those questions have to be asked. A safer product can remain useful. An industry can adapt. Consumers can keep their convenience. Workers can be protected. The match survived precisely because the industry eventually found a way to separate usefulness from unnecessary danger. Sometimes progress is not about creating something completely new. Sometimes it is about looking at something ordinary and asking whether there is a better way to make it. The workers who suffered from phossy jaw could not simply erase what happened to them. Changing the industry could prevent future suffering. It could not restore damaged bones, return lost health, or undo years of pain. That is why their place in the history of the match matters. They were not merely victims in a story about technology. They were part of the pressure that forced the technology and industry to change. Their suffering made an invisible danger visible. Their complaints helped expose conditions consumers rarely consider. Their resistance demonstrated that workers could challenge an industrial system. Public attention helped create pressure for reform. That pattern became increasingly important in industrial society. plants could produce more than ever before, but greater production also meant greater responsibility. The people inside the factory were not machines. They could become sick. They could be injured. They could organize. They could demand change. The match industry became one example of that broader transformation. Its history shows how a product can move through stages. First, it is an exciting invention. Then it becomes a commercial success. Then hidden consequences appear. Then society has to decide what to do. The process can take years, sometimes decades, but the result can be a better version of the original invention. The modern match is a product of that process. When people use one today, they benefit from improvements they may never think about. That is true of many everyday technologies. The safest version often becomes so ordinary that the dangerous version disappears from memory. But forgetting the dangerous version completely creates a problem. If people forget why a safety rule exists, they may stop understanding its value. That is why history matters. It preserves the reasons behind changes. The match reminds us that safety has a history. Rules have histories. Protections have histories. The ordinary conditions people expect in workplaces were not created automatically. They were shaped by conflicts, discoveries, failures, and demands for change. The match is a perfect example because the final object is so small. A tiny stick can hide an enormous system. Behind that system were real people whose lives were affected by choices made by manufacturers, governments, scientists, and consumers. The match eventually became so ordinary that its history almost disappeared. An invention that transformed everyday life became something people barely noticed. A box could sit inside a drawer for years. One match could be removed. One strike could create a flame. Moments later, the flame would be gone. The consumer would see only a few seconds of light, but those seconds represented generations of experimentation and change. The match had solved an ancient problem. Then, its success created a new industrial problem. The solution required more than invention. It required recognition that workers were being harmed, that the disease had a cause, that safer alternatives existed, and that an industry could change without abandoning the useful product. That is why the history of the match is ultimately a story about adaptation. The first versions were not perfect. The industry was not perfect. Production methods were not perfect. But they did not have to remain that way. Technology can improve. Industries can reform. Society can change its expectations. The match also shows why convenience is powerful. Once people get used to an easier way of doing something, they rarely want to return to the difficult way. The match made fire easy. That convenience became normal. And once it became normal, people stopped noticing how extraordinary it was. This is how many inventions disappear into everyday life. The telephone becomes a phone. Electricity becomes a switch. The internet becomes a screen. The match becomes a small box in a drawer. But history reveals what ordinary life hides. The match is a record of a period when chemistry, industry, labor, and consumer demand collided. It shows how an invention can improve millions of lives while creating terrible conditions for some of the people producing it. It shows how workers can challenge powerful industries. It shows how public attention can transform a private workplace problem into a social issue. And it shows how safer technology can replace dangerous technology without destroying the usefulness of the original invention. The match did not become safer simply because someone had a brilliant idea. Change required pressure, evidence, and people willing to say the old way was not good enough. The history of the match leaves us with a question that goes far beyond fire. What happens when something is useful, profitable, popular, and dangerous at the same time? The match industry faced that problem directly. The product worked. Consumers wanted it. Manufacturers could produce it. But the people making it could suffer terribly. That contradiction forced society to reconsider what progress meant. Progress could no longer mean only more products at lower prices. It had to include the people producing those products. It had to consider health, working conditions, and whether a cheaper method was worth its hidden cost. That lesson remains relevant because modern life is filled with products whose production happens far away from the consumer. We see the finished object. We do not always see the factory. We see the convenience. We do not always see the labor. We see the price. We do not always see the cost paid somewhere else. The match gives us a way to think about that invisible side of technology. It reminds us that inventions do not exist in isolation. They are part of systems. Those systems involve people. Whenever those systems create unnecessary danger, someone eventually has to decide whether change is worth the cost. In the case of the match, change became possible. Dangerous chemistry could be replaced. The product could remain. The flame could remain. Workers could be better protected. That is what makes the story more hopeful than it first appears. The match is not only a story of exploitation, it is also a story of correction. Society recognized a problem. Workers resisted. The public became aware. Science provided alternatives. Industry changed. An ordinary product became safer. The match therefore represents two kinds of progress. The first is technological progress, making fire easier. The second is social progress, making that convenience safer for the people who create it. The second may be less visible, but it is just as important. An invention is not truly successful if its benefits depend on unnecessary suffering. The real achievement comes when society finds a way to preserve the benefit while removing avoidable harm. That is what happened with the match. The flame lasts briefly. The lesson does not.